We know that transition is a really big deal, an important thing in the planning for good outcomes for our students, and especially our students with disabilities. There are certain pieces that need to be done, and families need to be, of course, aware of those requirements and those supported activities that will help their young one and soon to be adult one to be successful. And so what I'm going to do is introduce myself a little bit, and then we'll go right into the topic because we have about 50 minutes, and I just want to really make sure to provide you a nice, well-rounded overview of really some changes that are happening. What I think personally are really good changes. Orange County is already working on those changes, and then maybe, hopefully, fingers crossed, I can come back maybe in the second half of the year to do a follow-up, so that way we can really dive into what those changes are actually defined as by our Department of Education and Bureau of Exceptional Student Education. So that'll be really helpful too. So that being said, I'm Franklin Coker, and I'm a regional transition representative, and what I call RTR, just as because we live in acronym city, so not to throw another acronym out there, but I'm a regional transition representative, and there's 5 of me located throughout the state of Florida. I happen to cover the East Central Florida region, including Orange County backyard. I actually live just over the bridge in Volusia, but Seminole, Volusia, right on that St. Johns River line is where I live. So I'm accessible. I born and raised in Central Florida, went to UCF, UF for my graduate and undergraduate work. So, and by my trade, I'm a school psychologist. So I've actually, I was a classroom teacher, school psychologist, coordinator of secondary education, and then in Volusia County, and now work for Project 10. So what we do at Project 10, we're housed out of USF's St. Pete, University of South Florida, St. Pete. And what we do is we actually work with the Department of Education and work through USF to provide school districts, educators, parents, students, all the information and support and training that they need to understand what transition is, what it means to provide and reach those goals, those post-secondary goals, how to have compliant individual education plans during the transition age, and ensuring they graduate with a standard diploma and be remained engaged in their curriculum until they leave the K-12 system. So that is our parameters, our mission. And since there's only one of me in this whole area, my limit is that I have to really make use of efficiency and making sure that when I work with Orange, that I have a couple of key contacts to really have that conversation going. And when we do trainings and presentations, it really does support a more umbrella global effort as best as possible. So I'm not at individual IEP meetings, and I don't go to individual schools and work on individual interventions, because that, obviously, that would be really tricky to do with one person. So that being said, oh, I see Ingrid there. Hi, Ingrid. So I saw Ingrid pop up. She's one of the transition folks, along with Cannon, that I work closely with in Orange County specifically. So I'm excited to see her face too. So that being said, I'm going to go ahead and spend these next few, your lunchtime, if you will. And what I wanted to do is this. I wanted to really just tell you about transition. What does it mean? Just so we're all on the same page, because there's lots of definitions of transition out there. Then I want to kind of go into, there's been some really big changes that have recently happened legislatively. Everything that happens with individual education plans and requirements is done through legislation, whether it's federal at the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act that all states must abide by, or whether it's Florida-based, where we add Florida statutes and legislative requirements on top of IDEA. So we have to abide by that. And this past July 1st, there was a big change in terms of everything transition. It kind of moved timelines up. It added a couple of activities, and it was really proactive in the sense of what we think about when we think about transition. So I wanted to cover what that House bill, which is now going to be embedded as a Florida statute, what it says and means for us and the implications. And then I'm going to close it with highlighting a couple of key pieces like self-determination, self-advocacy, deferment, just maybe some career planning, and then some resources, including Project 10. So that is what the formula will look like. And during that time, feel free, Taranisha, Jill, to stop me, inquire, reference a chat box comment, or Jill, post some links that I already sent you as we talk about those topics. So that's the formula, that's the blueprint. We'll see how it goes, because we know blueprints, they change, right? So we'll see how it goes. All right. So now I'm going to attempt to share. I practiced this. I'm going to share my screen because I want to just have a little visual bookmark along the way. All right. And Jill, I see your face. If I have a thumbs up that you see this slide. Yep, perfect. Thank you. All right. So what is transition services? Because when you go to someone on the road, on the street, and you say, oh my gosh, what's your name? Susan. Susan, what does transition mean? Who knows what she's going to say, right? Oh, I transitioned here from my car to this spot where you asked me that question. Okay, that's true. Or we often think about transition too in the school setting as, oh, I'm transitioning from kindergarten to first, or even bigger, elementary to middle school, or middle school to high school. Some people call that a transition. Well, educationally, and as it relates to students with disabilities, transition actually means the process of planning for post-school outcomes. And so what we really mean is talking about those skills, activities, resources, and supports that lead to those after high school activities. And typically that's done definitely in high school and maybe sometimes in middle school, right? So middle to high to post-high school, that area is kind of called transition. And the reason why I say kind of called transition is because the state law in the past has mandated certain ages where certain transition activities begin and end. And most of those activities have historically been in the high school setting, depending on, okay? So that being said, I also want, and it's changed a little bit, which we'll go over, so that's kind of exciting, but it's a coordinated set of activities. It's your annual goals, the supports, some students have maybe short-term benchmarks or objectives. Maybe it's a related service. Maybe it's some kind of organizing, planning, technology piece that comes into support. Maybe it's assessments that are done and conducted. All of those pieces, depending on what that student needs, is collectively called the transition process or transition service. So it's coordinated and they're linked together to make sure good outcomes happen for a student. It's a results-oriented process. So we do things in school during their school age youth up until possibly 22. We do things because it leads directly to the need of that student as a result, as a goal. So if there is a service that's wanted or desired by any participant of that IEP team, before it's written on the IEP and says, yeah, you get this and you get that and you get this, you know, Oprah Winfrey, you get a car, you get a car, before all of the cars are given out, we have to make sure that that student needs it because it's part of their goal plan. And only if it's leading to that goal does that student may be considered as requiring that service or that process or that plan piece, okay? And we focus on improving outcome and functional achievement. It's always about growth and it's always about moving that needle further so that student can not only get a standard diploma, but obviously in that process get a standard diploma, but reach those post-secondary goals. And it could be education, it could be training, it could be independent living. It could be a lot of things that are goals for being an adult, right? So that's the definition of transition services. Now, when you actually write an individual education plan or you're part of that meeting annually, at least annually, when we talk about transition services, you'll often hear things like how it relates to education. You know, let's say college, technical training, CTE, apprenticeships, internships, etc. Those are all education opportunities. So we'll often talk about education as being a hallmark of what happens after high school. Even if it's directly to on-the-job training, or I want to go directly to employment, if that's your case, there's always going to be an education component about that job or that career when it comes to us discussing that and writing goals. It could be vocational education, integrative employment, maybe adult education, independent living, community participation, and it's always based on individual needs and accounts, we always start with the basis of strengths, preferences, and interests. So later, when you hear me talk about that House bill and legislative requirements when it comes to transition, you might hear me say age-appropriate transition assessments, right? That's going to be important. The reason why that's so important is because that's where it starts. That's where any blueprint for any student starts is, what are they interested in? What are they good at? What are they motivated by? Because you've got to assess what that is before you start reaching goals like, oh, well, you're going to be a vet tech, and oh, you're going to go to four-year University of Florida. So before you can write goals and before you can write services and needs and a plan, you got to assess what those strengths are. It always starts there. That's why it's going to be really important. And then lastly, what you might hear technically in an individual education plan when it comes to transition. So these are kind of cue words and phrases that you're in transition world, right? You are now in the transition planning phases if you're part of an IEP team that talks about, ooh, instruction. What are some ways that we're going to provide supports in the area of instruction to get that standard diploma? And if they're 15, 16, 17, 14 years old, it might have a little sway to it that talks about their future goals too. So you might see a combination of, oh, they need help in math and algebra, but my goodness, that's going to help them be that business tech goal that they are interested in. So we're going to combine that and really move forward with that annual goal. So you'll hear that kind of talk. You'll also hear related services. Maybe there's additional folks or services or activities that are needed for your son or daughter to be able to be successful in the post high school world, right? Community experiences. I'm a big believer that middle school and high school, especially high school, is the time to make sure that some of our students get those hands-on experiences about what employment is, about responsibility, about self-advocacy, self-determination, and independent functioning. It should not happen for the first time after high school. It should happen in meaningful ways during high school. And for some of our students, that's the best way of getting that experience needed to be successful, right? And then, of course, the last two bullets you might see is development of employment objectives. And then, if appropriate, and for some of our students, especially some of our students with maybe more significant needs or multiple needs, they might need additional daily living skill goals and maybe some evaluations or assessments to make sure that they're able to be independent or be more independent as they become adults. So these are just lingo statements that you'll hear that really hone in on transition. So all of these are part of that continuum of transition services. Legislatively, there's underpinnings for transition services, so we're not going to get into it, but I want you to know many of the things that we do in schools and what I'm talking about is because there's legislative weight behind it. It's not because Frank likes to do it and Taranisha, at the people she works with, they want to add special activities. No, we do it because it's the right thing to do, because it's embedded in what we know works. It's research, and legislatively, it's a requirement. It's the law. All right. So that being said, I want to just do a little pulse check before I walk through House Bill 173, because this is where there's going to be a lot of cool parts. We're okay. And I see Jill posted the link to the actual House bill page from the Florida legislature. And on that page, if you go to that link, you're going to see that there's many ways to download the text and revisions and updates along the way that House Bill 173 went through. But if you click on one of those icons, when you click that link and it says House Bill text, that's what I'm referring to here. So without further ado, if there's no questions, without further ado, what I'm going to do is share this text, and I see, let's see, I'm going to do my Jill check. Is that good? All right. So I'm not going to get too, deep into all of this part because we're not doing a legislative session and we're not writing bills. We're not going through a master class and writing bills. But what I wanted to do is share with you that ultimately this is a 5-page, if you can see at the top, it's tiny, but this whole bill of all these changes is 5 pages. That's not very many pages. And it actually takes the current Florida statute that existed before July 1 of 2021 and amended and changed and tweaked some language. So a lot of it stayed in place. But where it came to age or a grade statement, typically that was changed or amended, crossed out and added a new word. And they added at least 2 new activities that I'm going to cover. So let's talk about that. So it used to be the case before this bill that age 14 and age 16 were key ages in the world of education and transition in students with disabilities. Okay, so you know, if you were in 9th grade and age 14 and you had an IEP and you had let's say your disability category was students with a specific learning disability, boom, your IEP team needs to start talking about different things at age 14. Like, oh, let's talk about self-determination, self-advocacy. Oh, let's talk about resource links. Oh, let's talk about transition service needs, you know, in general. So they'll talk about that and write it in the IEP starting at age 14. And that goes for any kid with a student with a disability prior to July 1 of 2021. And then age 16 came along, and my gosh, you could be in 9th grade, you could be in 12th grade. Who knows what age, you know, 16 years old was for a lot of our kids. Some are back in middle school still, right? So, but no matter what, at age 16, boom, another set of requirements happened. And that's where new heavyweight additions of transition discussions and goals and writing and making sure you have your assessments in to make sure that these future blueprint goals are made. Services are attached, and we're really diving into all hands on deck. What does your future look like? Because we're talking about transition. And that's what happened at 16 and every year after until you left the K-12 system. So that in general was the timeline, way generalized, way simplified before July 1. But now that July 1 happened and this rule was authorized and in effect by the governor, by the legislators. So now I'm going to review what the new timelines are and what those new activities are, okay? So to help with this, I just want to scroll through, and basically you don't have, I'm not asking you to read this, but it really talks about the current language and transition service requirements that are in place, right? So that's kind of a little background there. And then when you scroll to page 2, these are my highlights. These are not highlights that you would see on that link that Jill posted. I highlighted this simply to share when you see yellow, it's talking about age 12 or 7th grade, whichever happens first. When you see yellow, you're thinking of that early age 12, 7th grade, because that's the new timeline, not 14 anymore. It's age 12 or during 7th grade, whichever happens first. And when you see aqua or blue, that I want you to think, oh, I'm helping you out because that has to do with age 14 or by day 1 of high school, whichever happens first. So when you see blue, it's that second hurdle that used to be, let's say, age 16, but now it's age 14 or by day 1 of high school. So know that when we go through this little piece here, okay? So as we walk through House Bill 173, which is now going to be Florida statute, and they're creating the rule and parameters right as I speak. Behind the scenes, they're really looking at all the rules this impacts and making sure it's all coherent to all stakeholders. So there's a lot of draft stuff going on in schools right now to try to understand and implement this House bill. So lots of good work is happening in Orange County. They're on the ball with it. But what this House bill requires activities to be done by age 12 is make sure we're identifying the need for transition services. Okay, so that has to happen by age 12. So in an IEP discussion, if you're age 11, turning 12 in like 6 months, that IEP at age 11 is when this discussion of identifying transition service needs is happening for your student, because it has to be in place on the IEP in which you turn 12. So really that means age 11. If you think about it like that, it really does mean when you're 11, that IEP is going to be kind of transition focused a little bit more. All right, I'm scrolling through the yellow. So what does it mean? Considerations of the student's need for instruction in the area of self-determination and self-advocacy. So by age 12, not only are we going to talk about transition service needs, we're also going to specifically talk about self-determination and self-advocacy. Okay, so I'll talk about that a little more. I'll dive a little more in just a minute after this, but that's important for students, especially with disabilities, to be successful in life. You got to advocate for yourself. You got to know yourself, know your strengths, and you have to be able to communicate that and be able to kind of plan accordingly. That is successful. That's important. And that's now going to be addressed and supported by age 12 by law. Also, by age 12, it's having that discussion about graduating with a standard diploma. What does that look like? What are those options? What does that mean to graduate with a standard diploma? So school districts now have to make sure to provide parents information on what standard diploma is, what those pathways might be, and just making sure we're all together as a team, parents, students, school, and other stakeholders on that travels to get to that standard diploma. No matter what kind of needs you have, you're earning a standard diploma. The question is, what are those pathways? What might that look like? You're not deciding at this point which pathway per se. You're having that discussion and knowledge about what those pathways are. So that's a requirement by age 12 or 7th grade, whichever happens first. Also, just know that standard diplomas often come with a merit or scholar designation opportunity. And so that information is also given out in addition to those graduation pathways by age 12, okay? Now, look at this on the screen. You see a big section in yellow. It says C, and there's lots of underlining. So in legislative world, underlining means addition, new text. So this actually this was not written in prior years, and we're just changing ages and grades. This is a brand new activity starting July 1, 2021 in the world of transition. And what does it say? I'm not going to read it, but it basically says information regarding transition services at the high school level, career and technical education, collegiate programs, Florida Center for Students with Unique Abilities, Florida Center for Independent Living, Vocational Rehabilitation, Agency for Persons with Disabilities, and Division of Blind Services are all entities that we as a school district are required to provide information on, or at least contact information and links to every student with a disability starting by age 12 annually to meet this transition requirement. So just know that school districts right now are working on ways to provide that in an efficient way, maybe like a little list or a little like sheet of resources that have maybe links and contact numbers or names. And it has at least all of these pieces, right? And my gosh, you might be asking, well, Frank, I have a high functioning student that doesn't require, Center for Independent Living, or maybe Florida Center for Students with Unique Abilities, because maybe those agencies support students with disabilities with much more significant needs. So, or Division of Blind Services. My kid sees 20/20. Why do I need to get information on Division of Blind Services? Well, number one, the law says it. It's specifically cited in the law that this information will be given out. But the other piece is, it's not like the IEP teams are necessarily going to be required to at length talk about Division of Blind Services to students and families that it doesn't pertain to. But we're at least sharing information and giving it to them so they're aware of that entity. They're aware of how to contact them in case something arises, because no longer, my guess is, this is Frank speaking, no longer will it be the case that parents and families graduate high school and we're unaware of the plethora of services that might be available to them throughout their middle school and high school years. Because we know that some might have wait lists, some might have application processes that need time. And if you're checking this out at 12th grade, it's probably too late, right? It's too late. So we're giving this information out. We're doing it annually. We're starting at age 12, and some of it may not apply to your student. Some of it may, but we're going to give it to you so that way you're fully more aware of all the resources that are available. Okay. So that's a new activity that's in House Bill 173. So that's age 12, right? I also want to mention too, that back to age 12, when we have to think about transition service needs and self-determination, self-advocacy, because remember, that's part of age 12 requirement to see, you know, ooh, we're going to think about transition, talk about transition. What are your needs? Self-determination. In order to assess your needs, what was it that I said a little while ago where it all starts? Right? I showed you a slide and I kind of said, oh, this little activity I'm about to mention, this is where it all starts with kids and their blueprints moving forward. And it's their strengths, preference, interests, right? And so how do we get that? How do we know if a kid needs transition services? How do we know if a kid needs self-determination, self-advocacy skills? How? How does the team even figure that out? The team figures it out in part through ways of assessing that student, through observations, informal and formal, and they're all age appropriate. So we'll talk about that a little bit, but all of those age appropriate assessments start happening by age 12 as well. They're appropriate for the age, they're appropriate for the student, they're appropriate for the needs of questions being asked, but nonetheless, they start by age 12 and they happen all throughout the year, every year, all the way until they leave us, because we're constantly adjusting and getting data to make sure that that plan is the right plan for that student as they exit our system. Okay, so I just wanted to mention that. Now, I'm going to go, before I go to the blue part, are there any questions that arose for the yellow part, the age 12 by grade 7, or during 7th grade, I should say? We might be all good. I see silence, might be like a thumbs up. Okay.
Yeah, there was nothing in the chat related to that specifically. There was one question from Erica just in regards to when the bill, when it goes into effect, and now
July 1, 2021 is
going forward.
Effect date. Mm-hmm.
And I shared that with her in the chat, but I just wanted to share in case anyone else, you know, wasn't keeping an eye on the chat that question was there. But other than that, I think we're good.
Okay, and now what used to be age 16, remember age 16 historically was that second big threshold where we start talking about post-secondary goals and all hands on deck when it comes to transition planning. Well, now think about those activities in some ways as they move that timeline, the bill, the legislation move that timeline up to age 14 or by day 1 of high school, whichever happens first. Okay, so all of this seems to be happening in middle school now, right? So take a step back. Middle school is where most transition activities are beginning and then fully being implemented in time for day 1 of high school. In some cases, some kids are turning 12 and 14 in 5th grade, or at least 12, but in 5th grade, we've seen that for a variety of reasons. They got retained, they were out of school, they moved in, transfer behind, whatever the case may be. We do have some students by age 12 are impacting 5th grade. So we go to our elementary schools and kind of work with our team to make sure they're doing those early transition activities per this bill. But I want you to think as middle school, we have 3 years, 6th grade to 8th grade, by age 12, by day 1 of high school to really implement a lot of these activities. And then when you get to high school, it really is kind of monitoring and updating and making sure that that plan is being worked at and being accomplished. So I want you to take that big picture away from this piece. But now let's go in. What are those requirements by age 14 or by day 1 of high school? Well, we have to, in order to identify those post-secondary goals, right, we have to be able to do age-appropriate transition assessments and writing those post-secondary goals. So you're going to see here that that is actually item C. So I skipped ahead. That's item C, is a appropriate, measurable, long-term post-secondary goals and education goals based on transition assessments. That's not new. That's historically been there, but it's basically writing those after high school, long range, what education and training goal are we having for this student based on data and based on the student's needs? What are we doing in terms of career and employment? And what are we doing for some kids for independent living? Okay, so that's one piece that's not new. We're just moving it up to by day one of high school. We're going to start writing those and formalizing those, right, as an IEP team. And then we're also, as I work backwards here, a statement of intent to receive that standard high school diploma before they exit our system. So we're actually going to make sure that we're documenting the diploma they're earning and then the intent to earn that standard diploma before they age out or before they free and appropriate public education ends by age 22. Okay. And there is a short little description that and it's not new. This is not new because you don't see underlined, but it's not new. We used to just do that by age 16. Now we're doing it by age 14 or by day one of high school. All right, I'm going to skip up to here where it says the statement must document okay, so here is where the underlying part happens, and that is new activities. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this afterwards, but the new activities are related to deferment. So when I say the word deferment, this bill basically moved up some activities that are required regarding this whole thing called deferment. Deferment is a word that means I'm not going to receive something right now. I'm going to put it over here in a safe spot and hold it, but I'll come back later to get it. Okay, so that that's a general, that applies to a lot of scenarios, this word deferment. For some of you, you might have had deferment for a loan, a student loan. That's a popular connection. That means if you defer your loan, it doesn't mean you don't have to pay it. It just means it stays over here, safe and sound, no penalties, no interest. We're going to keep it over here. But after a certain time, we're going to come back and then you're going to restart it again, right? That's deferment in that sense. Deferment in this sense applies to standard diploma and receiving ESE services under an IEP and free and appropriate public education. That's what deferment means in this case. So it means that some students with disabilities will require additional services and supports past the time that they would typically earn their standard diploma because they're under age 22. And based on the way that the needs are written, the goals are written, and the remaining gaps that exist for them to reach their future goals, that IEP team will need to defer that student's receiving of that standard diploma. We'll keep it, the school keeps it. No, you're not going to get it, student. I know you earned it, but we're going to keep it because we deferred it. But you're going to keep coming to school or keep getting transition services in the community so you can have a better shot. You can have a better shot at reaching your post-secondary goals because you require it. And you may need until 22 to get it. But at that point, we'll give you your standard diploma because you earned it. So you'll get it. Or you might defer because it's the IEP team, had that meeting and they said deferment. And you might only need an additional year of support. And you're only 20 and you decide, you know what, let's take my diploma. It's been sitting in a safe spot. I want to come get it now because I'm ready. Boom, you get it. So that's deferment in Florida when it comes to standard diploma. So that being said, if you look at the language, the state of Florida has added new steps in terms of what deferment process and decision-making thresholds there are throughout that course of that student's life in a K-12 system. So that's new. So let's look at it. It says by age, basically, so this is blue. So by age 14 or day one of high school, whichever happens first, there must be a statement to document the process that a student with a disability would need to meet to receive or to defer their standard diploma. So before you go to high school, every student with a disability, and as part of that IEP team, must have a discussion about what the deferment process is, what it is, what does it mean, what are the pieces to that before you actually make that deferment decision later in high school, and you document that on the IEP that discussion and understanding happened. So that's new. That happens by day 1 of high school. And then if you look down here, let's see, where is it? Right here. All this underlined part here, this actually, I know it's in blue, but it actually applies. It's so interesting here. So bear with me. This activity is in regards to deferment, but it happens by the beginning of the senior year in which that student is about to graduate. So by the time that student reaches their last year of schooling, the IEP team needs to do this activity as it relates to deferment. And what it means is the IEP team must have a signed statement by the parent or adult age student that they understand the process for deferment and that they are selecting or intending to select which option, deferment or no deferment, that is appropriate, that they would like. So it says here, for the IEP in effect at the beginning of the school year, the student is expected to graduate. So what I'm, for some kids, I'd like to say, oh, by 12th grade, but we know that sometimes kids go from 10th to 12th grade because of certain conditions or certain credit pieces. So that's why the language is very interesting here. The statement must include a signed statement by the parent, guardian, or the student if the student has reached the age of majority and rights have transferred to the student. So that would be that if that student's 18 and rights have been transferred, that he or she understands the process for deferment and identifying if the student will defer the receipt of his or her standard diploma. That's that new activity that happens. What I say is, by the end of 11th grade, but what the bill says specifically as just before the last year the student is expected to graduate. Okay. And so what this means is that we're making an IEP team decision with parent and adult age student or student together as a team before they get into their last year of school. And so it gets interesting because we're waiting on more clarification from DOE regarding what, because there's some interesting parameters around that. But in essence, what I want you to know is this: as parents, don't get worried right now about, oh, I need to defer, not defer, oh my, oh me. We're focused on making sure your student is earning a standard diploma. We're focused on making sure those transition activities are being done starting by age 12. And we're focused on making sure you understand what deferment is and how you're eligible. So that way, by the time we're approaching senior year, it all comes together, because it should not be a OMG surprise. I didn't know anything about deferment and I've got 1 week to decide. What does that mean? No, because the deal is the whole time you're in high school, we're working on those goals. We're understanding where your gaps are. We're understanding what those transition opportunities and programs might be. So we would know, all of us, right, by the end of your junior year, we would know whether it's appropriate or not and what we're deferring for and what that senior year is going to look like. That's the cool part about this, is because it flows together with all the other transition requirements. Okay. So hopefully that makes sense. And that's House Bill 173. So it just moves ages up, defines age or grade. So no longer is a kid floating in high school and they've never heard of transition just because they're young. So it moves that up. It's happening primarily in middle school, and it adds 2 new activities. It adds the fact that we're giving out lots of information starting by age 12. And we're also making sure deferment is a known process and everyone understands what it is, and not just waiting until, the very end to pop a big question, right? So that's what House Bill 173 ultimately does in a nutshell. So I'm going to open it up to make sure, Taranisha and Jill, if there were any comments you want to reflect or questions.
Yes, and give me one moment. I'm scrolling through some of the questions. Sorry, as we drop links, the questions are then moved back. there was a question specific to APD and the fact that there is an extremely long waiting list, which I believe we all know. So the question was, which organizations would you specifically recommend that can be involved with the transition process sooner to, I guess, get around that waiting list?
So well, that's an interesting question because the Agency for Persons with Disabilities is a vital, necessary agency and support for students with complex or intense needs. It's going to be because they supply the Medicaid waiver pieces. They're going to supply things that ultimately would support that student in their adult life, right? And the waiting list is long. I understand. I've heard stories like, you know, they throw out 10 years, 8 years. I'm like, I can't even, like, that's right. It's like, wow. But if this information is given out by age 12, right? 11 by age 12, even I'm not trying to be like utopian and just, you know, pie in the sky here, but even if there was an 8 to 10 year waiting list, then that would be almost perfect timing that when they leave the K-12 system in some cases, then they're close to picking up their 8 to 10 year waiting list on APD. So I would say APD actually needs to occur as a resource support even before, because this law says by that age, right? No later than 7th grade or by age 12 must you do this. But we know that kids in 1st grade, 2nd grade, we already know as an IEP team, they're going to need the support of APD in the future. So why not make that referral then? That way in high school, that connection is made. So I just wanted to put a plug about the earlier age, and then we should even do it in elementary school for APD. And it's not a substitute for any other agency, really. It's a needed agency that needs to be connected sooner rather than later. But to your question, what are there's lots of other opportunities out there that can kind of supplant resources and support along the way while you're waiting for really intense adulthood services. And for example, vocational rehabilitation is one agency that really supports, starting by age 14, a lot of pre-employment transition services. And if you have the needs that you would need for APD, you would certainly likely qualify to get support through VR in work-related experiences, especially as you start getting in the community and those community experiences. So I would say VR is a great resource. And then what I'm going to do too is I'll share with the parents on this luncheon or lunch
Lunch and learn.
presentation, right? I'm going to share with them lots of resources that are on our Project 10 website that you can tap into too, especially under Orange County. We have a little tab that you can kind of navigate through there. So yeah, I would say VR, and I would say the Central Florida Interagency Council. I have a slide at the end that has their website. So in Central Florida Interagency Transition Council, in fact, Jill, you might want to plug it in now in the chat box. That is a really good resource, because what happens is there's key stakeholders in Seminole and Orange County that get together every month and they share resources. They highlight certain agencies and they plan accordingly for transition supports for stakeholders. And on their website, they included a resource guide. So if you go to that resource guide off of their website, you'll see that there's Orange and Seminole County entities that really support students with varying levels of needs, whether it's communication, physical, health-wise, anything like that, needing peer groups, peer mentors, experiences in the community with non-disabled peers, et cetera. They have resources and links underneath our resource guide. So I would say use that as a resource tool too.
Tarnisha, can I jump in real quick?
Go for it.
Franklin, a quick question. I know you said, especially for ADP, the earlier the better, if we know that would be the need. But would you say even starting the transition process, not by 12, but even earlier, like you said, 5th, would you recommend, or would that be a good move to say as a district, you know what, we're going to start having that meeting at 5th grade and we're going to look at that and go from there?
So there's two answers to this. My says I love early transition planning. Oh my gosh, I would love if it were my world in my school, I would be like, oh, you know what, like this is appropriate to enter middle school with, right?
Right.
But here's the key though. Districts are really large systems, right? And
Correct.
so the deal is the law says these need to happen at these ages. If to say to a district you're going to do that a year earlier, 2 years earlier, 3 years earlier, it's there's a lot of nuances that happen because elementary, there's a lot going on in elementary, and to move transition fully in all aspects to 5th grade or 4th grade, while it might sound beneficial, you want to make sure that you have the capacity to be able to do that at that earlier age, even though the law doesn't require it and you're just doing it to be like, awesome practice. The impact that it has on a 4th grade team to do A through Z that they're already doing to make sure they're being successful in elementary, and then to add a precursor event that's not required for another year or two, I don't know the capacity of that. And so it would involve key stakeholders all agreeing to that. But I like early. That's me.
No, and I had thought about, we have been in conversations in regards to expanding our transition services and our support, and that was one of the areas we were thinking, can we do it earlier? Would it help to do it earlier?
So VR, just as a side note, VR, even though transition planning and service really starts at least by age 12, 7th grade, right, that I mentioned from this House bill, VR starts their pre-employment transition services and connections and support for students with disabilities at age 14. So that's not moving to age 12, that's moving to age 14 because they're work-based. Students can't work at age 12, right? So as long as work is kind of an age 15, 16 thing, then VR is going to start their formal support process with pre-employment transition services at age 14, and that's that. So the earlier you start transition supports and process, the more you just have to be able as a district to be able to provide those supports in-house, right? You're going to have to provide them in-house. You're going to have those experiences in middle school and elementary school. So there's a lot to it when you move it up, because what are you going to do about it when you say yes, 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 they need yes, yes. And so it's really dynamic. It's really complex, more complex than you would ever imagine. When you start digging in, you're like, oh my. But at the end of the day, how I like to think of it is, it's always okay to talk precursor transition planning and note it at the IEP meetings in elementary school, in those present levels, in those, you know what I'm saying? It's like, wow, what are they interested in? What do you think they might need? Let's give you this connection. Let's talk about that's okay to do all of that. But later you'll be opening up new compliance pieces in peer. Boom, 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 a new page here. And by the way, parents, peer, don't worry about that. It's just the way we document all of those needs goes systematically into this place where everyone is able to see what is actually happening. And so we start doing that as soon as these requirements are made in age 12 and age 14 and beyond. So yeah, that's a great question. And I would say if your team and your school has the capacity to early identify, I would say that would be a really cool, easy activity to do at your annual IEP meeting.
I had another question for you, Franklin. This one's coming from Ingrid. She was asking, does this apply to our current high school seniors? So those that are graduating this school year, do those new changes outlined in House Bill 173 apply to those senior students?
Right. So I don't have the rigid answer. This is one of those common questions that districts are having regarding grandfathering effect and what happens to that student. We just had an IEP for 2 months ago, 3 months ago, but now this law. So there's a lot of good questions surrounding that. And so I've been asking my districts to kind of inquire with DOE until they actually supply like a frequently asked questions or a TAP regarding a technical assistance paper. But I would say when possible and appropriate, make sure that your students that are graduating this year are, especially if they're having IEPs coming up, like if there's an IEP coming up next month, I would say make sure that that student and that IEP has those resources provided to them that were, happening by age 12 now. Make sure they have that. And as far as deferment, obviously you can't go back in time and do the 11th grade deferment thing because they're 12th grade. Obviously that makes sense. But I would say make sure that you're having those deferment decisions and questions made like sooner. Like if it's in November, my recommendation would be, it would probably benefit the team to consider that now versus wait until March or April or whenever we're used to having that decision making. So Ingrid, what I can do is we can work. I have ways of getting additional information, but it would come through you in Orange County, so that way you can get that information versus through me, if that makes any sense. But there's lots of questions, right? I mean, it's easy to say, oh, all future 11-year-olds, now they go through this process, easy peasy, great, we know what to do. But what about those students who are in the midst of this process and they don't have these elements? My always answer is do the best you can with all future IEP meetings, making sure that these are in place. And if appropriate for some students, ensuring that maybe, I mean, I don't want to say amendments have to occur, but for some kids and some families, amendments might have to be made because it particularly impacts them or their what age or grade that they're in, considering the needs of the student. So, but that's a blanket thing, so it gets hard to kind of go into individual cases. But the implications are for families that because the transition process is happening earlier by age 12, and really, you know, in elementary school, as a school psychologist, I'm saying this from a viewpoint of a school psychologist as a coordinator, I often saw parents and families heavily involved in elementary school processes, right? Initial eligibility, making sure their student is getting through 5th grade successfully. And then it's, you know, over time, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, and high school, you know, there's that, oh, they're becoming adults, so I'm going to back off and, you know, not be as involved because they're more independent, etc. But what this implication is of this transition piece is that by the time elementary school ends, boom, it automatically kicks into transition planning. And I would say transition planning, that process is probably the most important process that a student can go through to make sure that they're prepared for life. So it's not just prepared to get a standard diploma. Woo, you got a diploma, yay, you're 18, now life. It's transition. If we do it right and we get all stakeholders on board and we keep families involved, then I think we have a real impact of making sure that not only is that kid successful in earning a standard diploma at 18, but at 22 and at 25 and at 28 and at 45 after they have kids and they're in a relationship, and at 60 and then they retire, that they actually had a really good start to a good future, independence, financial stability. You know, it's self-advocating and knowing, you know, how to get what you need. That is priceless. And it's like a MasterCard commercial, but I would say don't lose engagement with the school and with your son or daughter because elementary school is over. You're just going into now transition phase, and that's probably the most important phase, 6th grade through 12th, for that kid's life. That's the implications. So get this. So we've been talking a lot about House Bill 173, right? And we might have a question or two more, but you know what? Crazy me, I had all these slides thinking, oh, we're going to cover this and cover that and cover this and cover that. And I see the time and our lunch is over. So what I'm going to do is hopefully ask Taranisha if we can have a part 2, and all the stuff I was going to talk about in the next several slides, I was actually going to include in part of the formal transition basics, part 2 training. And by then we'll have a lot of clarity, or hopefully a lot more clarity with some parameters, because we'll get technical assistance from DOE. So we can really tell you, this is what it looks like. This is what, you know, that resource page looks like. This is what Orange County is doing, etc. So I'd like to take my next several slides and reserve them for when I get to see you again. But I want to leave though with Nisha, Jill, are there additional questions that I can kind of answer?
I've actually provided a link in the chat for student-specific questions or additional questions, just to respect everyone's time. I know some parents and families have attempted to get off of work at a specific time for this. So I did provide that link for those additional questions, and we will respond to those directly for individuals that still have other questions. The resources that were shared today, we will have those linked out so that parents are able to visit those as well, in addition to the recording of this session. Franklin, I'm just going to answer you now for everyone to hear. You can absolutely come back and do a part 2. This has been phenomenal today. And we'd love to hear more as the DOE, clarifies things for us. I'm just glancing really quickly to see if there's anything that, like, absolutely right now we need to answer. Erica, I see that you had quite a few questions. And like I said, I will get to you directly with the answers to some of those questions.
And while you're looking, Taranisha, Project 10. So, I work with Project 10, Transition Education Network, TEN. That's where the 10 comes in, but they use the 10 as a clever way of logoing it. But we actually have a wealth of resources and information. Anything I talked about today, if you're asking about transition assessments, resources, independent living, what are those Orange County things? Where's Central Florida Interagency Council, etc. Jill might have posted in the chat box the Project 10 link, but I'm asking all of you to take a few moments this weekend, this evening, go on to Project 10's website, save it as a favorite, and just go back to it on occasion, because that is where we research, get really healthy, good for you, nutritious data and information, and supply it on our website. And we have an amazing publications link on our website. It's called Publications. And on that, if you just link to Publications, you're going to see like 24 transition resource guides, roadmaps, trail maps, checklists, everything like that are going to be so helpful for you. The caveat is, because House Bill 173 was really big and it moved ages earlier and it added 2 new activities, many of those guides, we have to go in and adjust certain paragraphs and certain pieces. And we are awaiting on approval and vetting to adjust them in just the right way by DOE and the Bureau of Exceptional Student Education. So when you go there now to link, it's great, but just know the House bill that I went over today, think about that when you're looking at the resource, because in about a month or 2, we're going to upload directly. The new resource is going to look exactly the same. We're just going to change the language and make it accurate. And then you'll be able to have what's really good for you, hopefully by Christmas.
Awesome. Thank you.
To close.
No, I love it. Thank you. You actually did the closing for me. So fantastic. Again, thank you so much, Franklin, for sharing this information with families. Again, just the level of engagement in the chat box just proved what we said, that it's absolutely needed. So we will definitely have you back for part 2. Families, I am going to provide you with a survey link in the chat box. When you have a moment, please fill that out. It gives us important information in regards to the types of topics that you'd like covered during our workshops, as well as just feedback for myself, for Franklin, about things that we could adjust in regards to providing you the information you need to best support your student. So I'm going to go ahead and link that out in the chat. Like I said, you do have the link for specific questions, or if you think about something later on today that you're like, whoa, I didn't ask that, you have that link. Feel free to use it. We will get back to you directly. And again, thank you all for attending and making time for this session. We do appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing you at the Parent Academy in November. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Franklin. Didn't disappoint. It was wonderful. Thank you.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. Hi, Allie. I see you there too. Hi, Allie.
Always a rock star, Franklin.
And Ingrid, get in touch with me if regarding that, because that's tricky. That is a really tricky question you asked. Most districts are asking that.
Okay.
It is
I was just speculating because that seems to be they're going to be in that window, because you're going to have students that have entering their senior year, but their IEP for their senior year was completed prior to July 1.
Right.
So that's why I was like, ooh, what do we do with those kids in that bubble?
Right. And and that is a good question. I would say, you'll hear like amendment, making sure that those students have that deferment decision locked in per the law, because you don't want to, you know, right now the current rule is January 30th through May 15th.
Mm-hmm.
This is happening at least 6 months earlier. And right. And that's a good question. And I don't want to tell you the wrong answer, but I've been told that I see messages about being amendments, but there's
So
reality to that.
I was going to ask also, are you hearing anything like normally we would attend IEP meetings or, you know, we're communicating with schools or teachers. We've identified students we want to recruit into, you know, ESE transition school. However, it's now getting close to that deadline to defer. And all of a sudden, then sometimes you get parents that are in panic mode and then they want to now defer their student's diploma, which is fine. So is this trying to take away that frenzy of the April, May deadline and to try to have this to be a little bit more streamlined and we're moving through the process much more steadily with much more knowledge and information as opposed to, okay, my kid graduates in 3 weeks, now what?
Yeah, I would bet on that. I would bet on Taranisha, you probably have to close the room and go. Ingrid.
Yes, I was actually going to say I can go ahead and just heads up to everyone. I'm going to go ahead and remove all the other participants just to kind of shut the room down. And then that way, if you guys need to continue to cross, then that's perfectly fine. But I wanted to give them the heads up before they all started kind of disappearing from the room. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Hi, Jill.
Hello, Jennifer. Okay, so I think it's just, all right, you guys are free to be, I just was like,
just a couple more minutes. I know you're hosting.
Right.
So Ingrid, so I would say this, I would bet on the philosophy, and who knows, maybe this is just a result that it makes it seem like, oh, that's a really good philosophy. And really it got there in a different way, right? There was underpinnings to move this along where earlier, but the net result is